Maverick from YouTube sent me this question. I need help. Before a turn, when I use the trail braking technique, do I close the throttle or do I keep it steady and use the front brake at the same time? I can't figure out how to do it right. I would be very grateful for an explanation of this process. Hi, my name's Dave, and I've been a professional rider coach for 25 years. I'm currently a champion certified coach with the Yamaha Champ School. I'm certified with the USMCA. I taught state basic rider courses for over a decade, and I even work with our local highway patrol motor officers. I answer this question all the time, but the answer is typically buried in the middle of another video. So let's dedicate this time to this one very specific question. Now, to fully understand why this is such a confusing point, we should start with a little bit of a history lesson. Now don't worry, this will make the answer so much clearer. You see, the curriculum taught by the overwhelming majority of riding programs today is fundamentally based on concepts from the 50s and early 60s. You know, a time before the average home even had a television set. Bikes in the 50s were quite a bit different than bikes of today. They had these noodly, mild steel cradle frames and suspension that had little to no damping. They were basically just springs. And bias ply tires that offered grip in the academic sense, but nothing compared to the modern marvel of radial motorcycle tires today. Those old bikes were flexi flyers, to say the least. I mean, I had a vintage Triumph that I restored that was so bad that the paint would flake off the frame at the flex points. If it got unsettled and started wobbling and wiggling around in a corner, the only way to get it to settle down was to add throttle. But more importantly, those old bikes had cable-actuated drum brakes instead of hydraulic disc brakes like what we have on modern motorcycles. So when you squeeze the brakes, or even more accurately, when you grab the brakes, they would do nothing, 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 and then grab all at once. So this old school advice of getting all your braking done before corner tip in and then gentle acceleration throughout the rest of the corner, well, it made sense. But as time marched on, everyone who knew there was more to it than just that. You see, motorcycles are designed and engineered by expert riders, the way expert riders ride. And by the late 60s, a lot of the experts had figured out there was a lot to be gained by this technique called trail braking. If you watch the amazing film On Any Sunday 2 that came out in 1981, you can watch as King Kenny Roberts on his GP 500 two-stroke race bike trail brakes into the corners. So just for clarity, trail braking just means trailing off brake pressure as motorcycle lean increases. It's a terrible name, but it comes from the car world. When we are straight up and down, we can brake fairly hard, but as lean increases, we have to give up brake pressure to allow for cornering loads, trailing off brake pressure. And despite the fact that the best motorcycle riders in the world figured the technique out on a racetrack because it helps with races, it's not a technique that you only use to go faster. You see, you don't win races, and you certainly don't win championships by skittling off into the gravel trap. And this is a key point that I'm going to touch on here again in a second. If we want to become the best riders we can be, we need to pay attention to what the best riders in the world who aren't crashing, what are they doing? You see, the safety benefits of trail braking are pretty easy to identify. It's a technique primarily for improving safety and precision. With trail braking, we're actually going slower in the middle of the corner where we'd be carrying the most amount of lean and the most risk than we would if we tried to accelerate throughout the entire corner where we have to increasingly add more and more and more lean angle. Gently slowing into a corner, we get more grip from the front tire because we're loading the tire, which presses it into the ground and makes the contact patch bigger, so we're effectively riding on more rubber. Plus, and this is a big plus, when we gently slow into a corner, if something unexpected happens, from a crashed rider in front of us to an unexpected pile of gravel, we save precious time and space by not having to transition from throttle to brakes while we're at lean. So here's where the plot thickens. Freddy Spencer, one of the greatest motorcyclists of all time, who won the GP250 and GP500 championship in the same year, which never happens, and it'll probably never happen again. In today's vernacular, it would be like Marc Marquez winning the MotoGP and Moto2 championship in the same year. It's unheard of. Well, after his retirement from racing, he started a riding school where he advocated strongly for trail braking because over his career, he saw all the benefits that it provided, especially for dealing with the unexpected. Now, the story goes that one day he was talking to his students about he would overlap the throttle and the brake on his 500cc two-stroke GP race bike to help keep the bike under control. He would overlap the throttle with the rear brake to work like an early version of traction and wheelie control. But there was a student in the class who didn't quite understand what he was saying, but regardless, went on to publish a book and then start a riding school based on this incorrect definition, this misunderstanding that trail braking is overlapping throttle and front brake. Now, since then, Freddy Spencer has gone to great lengths to try to clear this up. Even if you go to the channel, the Champ School YouTube channel, I'll put a link right up here. He has an entire video where he talks about this at length. But as far as I know, that book is still as it was originally published, and it is still being taught this way despite efforts to clear up this misunderstanding. And this is why it is so hard to find clear information about this topic. And to make matters worse, Rider Magazine published an article called Throttle that espouses the benefits of using brake and throttle together through the corner, keeping the front tire loaded with the front brake. There are a ton of YouTube videos from well-respected channels where they call this incorrect technique pressure braking, keeping pressure on the front brake as we maintain throttle throughout the corner. Even Dr. Ray Ox, the head guy who develops and approves all the training from the Motorcycle Safety Foundation. I was listening to a presentation from him where he talked about it. I think he was riding Deal's Gap, and he was practicing trail braking by overlapping throttle and front brake through all those technical corners. And he came to the conclusion that it was an expert-only technique because it was extremely hard to do, and it absolutely should not be taught. And he's 100% correct. This misunderstood definition of trail braking should not be taught, in my opinion, to anyone. Not only is it extremely hard to do well, even at really slow speeds, it's fundamentally dangerous, and here's why. If you know anybody who races or does track days, ask them about the time they accidentally overlapped throttle and front brake. It happens fairly often. So what happens is typically on hot days, your gloves will get wet and sweaty, and the leather on the palm can sometimes ball up in your hand, especially if your gloves are a little bit older. And when you roll off the throttle to the front brake, the leather will prevent the throttle from closing 100%. And I can tell you from personal experience, it's bad. So I was going into Tooele turn at our local track, and the throttle stayed open, maybe only like 1 or 2%, like it was barely on at all. And I remember braking into the corner, and the bike wouldn't slow down, and it wouldn't turn. I started running wide, I was out onto the rumble strips, and before I realized what was going on, and I was able to close the throttle the rest of the way, get the bike turned before I ran off the track. But I bet you I see at least 2 or 3 crashes per summer from racers and track day riders where this happens, and instead of saving it, they end up in the gravel. So if you spend time on track and this has happened to you, tell your story down in the comments. Help me save some lives here. Overlapping throttle and front brake results in the bike being in a state of imbalance. Remember, motorcycles are designed by expert riders for how they ride. And we're all going to be better off when we ride the motorcycle the way they're designed to be ridden. The front brake tells the motorcycle to slow down and turn. The throttle tells the motorcycle to stand up and go faster. When we try to combine these two opposing controls, we're giving the bike conflicting instructions, and it rarely works out. Now, there are some very rare exceptions here that you're likely going to hear about, so let's talk about them really quickly. Number 1, can we overlap throttle and rear brake? Yeah, totally. That's what Freddy Spencer was originally talking about. Overlapping some rear brake can be extremely beneficial in many scenarios, and most common would be slow speed maneuvers where we can maintain a steady, smooth throttle and control our speed very easily. Number 2, you will hear how some of the top level pros are doing it. You're going to hear names like Andrea Iannone and Casey Stoner. In an interview, Stoner talked about how one year the Ducati GP bike, the front end was terrible. And in a few specific situations, he kept crashing mid-corner. And he found the only way to maintain race pace and not crash was that he would still trail brake into the corner with the throttle totally closed. But at the end of the braking event, when he was getting the bike turned and transitioning back to throttle, he would briefly overlap. He would sneak the throttle on for a brief instant before the brake was fully released. This summer, Aleix Espargaro revealed that Pedro Acosta, new hotshot Pedro Acosta, was overlapping throttle and front brake. Once again, the KTM is known for not having a very good front end, and the Michelin tire, the MotoGP Michelin front tire, is notoriously bad. What Acosta was doing is he was briefly overlapping as he was rolling off the throttle to begin braking before entering the corner to smooth the weight transfer onto the front tire. So whenever these extremely rare instances come up, the professional riding world loses their collective mind because overlapping throttle and front brake is something that nobody who is any good does. I think this speaks to kind of how special these very, very few riders are at adapting to a very specific problem that you and I are never going to face. In fact, it's a problem that the overwhelming majority of professional riders never really face. Obviously, Yamaha Champ School, where I'm certified, they don't advocate for overlapping throttle and front brake. Sylvain Guintoli, he's a test rider, World Superbike MotoGP racer. He's fantastic. He has a spectacular YouTube channel, and the information he shares for free on his channel is absolutely brilliant. But he says we never use the front brake and the throttle at the same time. Now, I've gotten to meet a bunch of pro riders with what I get to do, and none of them have ever advocated for running throttle against the front brake. You're also going to hear folks who say they do the throttle thing and they think it's awesome. But here's the thing. When we have good grip and the speeds are low, we can get away with a lot of really weird things. But the reason why we pay attention to best practices, racing, and the best riders in the world is that high speed and low grip are basically the same thing because we're riding at the limits of grip. We're doing whatever the tire's capable of. So we don't necessarily care about techniques that only work when conditions are ideal. We need to focus on techniques that work when the speed is up or when the grip is down, when everything matters. And I really think that this issue and this confusing, dangerous, misunderstood technique is really telling as to how much damage can be done by one well-meaning influencer. And this is a struggle not only for our sport, but across the board because of things like this platform. It's harder to find the truth with all the noise. Riding well is not a democratic process. We don't necessarily do what the majority of average riders do. We don't necessarily look at the Reddit comment with the most upvotes as being the most correct. We don't look at the channel with the most subscribers or the most polished content as being the most accurate. And we don't look at the weird, random, rare outliers. We look at best practices. We look at the best riders in the world who aren't crashing. What are the majority of them doing? So now back to the original question. Don't overthink the process. The correct sequence is we roll off the throttle, 100% off the throttle to the front brake, and we slow until we're happy with our speed and direction. If we're happy with our speed before corner entrance, that's fine. There is no rule that you have to brake past that. But if not, we can trail off front brake pressure as motorcycle lean increases. If it's a long sweeping corner, we can go to neutral throttle and the radius our bike is turning at will stay the same. But we wait until we can see our exit and take away lean angle before accelerating. The correct answer to almost every motorcycle question begins with, it depends, except in this case. When do we overlap throttle and front brake? Never. We never overlap throttle and front brake. Thanks to Mavercheck for the great question. If you have a question, I'm pretty easy to find. We have our own Discord server. You can ask it there. We have our own subreddit. We're our Canyon Chasers. And I'm on Blue Sky now. I don't spend a whole lot of time on Instagram and Facebook, but I post stuff there from time to time. Please click like and subscribe. It's the best way to really help a channel like this grow. Thank you so much for watching. Ride on in. ride well.